Hi, and welcome to our book tasting program today. I'm Miss Karen, and I am the Adult Program Director here at the library, and I'm going to be reading for our book tasting program today the book Jane Eyre, which is a book we have here in the library. And this particular book is one that is adapted from the original, and it was adapted by Jan Fields. Chapter 1, The Ghost. The cold winter wind had brought gloom and rain. I was glad of it. I never liked long walks on chilly afternoons, and the bad weather saved me from one. Eliza, John, and Georgiana played around their mamma in the drawing room. I was not invited. Mrs. Reed insisted I keep my distance from her and her darlings. I preferred my own company anyway. I slipped into the breakfast room and sat cross-legged in the window seat with a book in my lap. Then the door flew open. "Madam Mope," cried John Reed, "where is she?" I had drawn the curtain when I slipped into the window seat. It was unlikely John would have found me, but Eliza put her head in at the door and said, "She's in the window seat." I came out immediately, as I had no wish to be dragged out. John snatched away my book. "You have no money, and you ought to beg and not live here with gentlemen's children like us. I'll teach you not to touch my things. Everything in this house is mine." He insisted I go and stand by the door. I went. He flung the heavy book at me, and it knocked me down. I struck my head on the door, and it began to bleed. The blood and the pain opened the door to the anger in me. The hot anger that had longed to come out for all the years I had been trapped in that cold house. "Wicked boy," I said, "you are an evil bully." He ran at me then and grabbed my hair. I felt a drop or two of blood trickle down my neck, and I fought back wildly. John screamed, and Mrs. Reed rushed into the room with our nursemaid, Bessie, and another maid, Abbott. "Take her away to the Red Room," Mrs. Reed said. "Lock her in there." I was dragged upstairs and locked in. The Red Room was kept clean, but never used anymore. The servants were a bit afraid of it, and I was terrified. This was the very room where Mr. Reed had died many years before. Mr. Reed was my uncle. He was the one who insisted I be brought to live with them when my parents died of typhus fever. On his deathbed, he had made Mrs. Reed swear to raise me as her own. It was that promise that froze my blood now. Mrs. Reed had surely broken it. I lived there, but she hated me, and her children tormented me. Would Mr. Reed now see that their treatment had come back from the grave? The very thought of the cold hand of comfort from a ghost made my heart race in my chest. The room was dark from the cloudy day. Bessie had left me a lantern, and the flickering glow cast shadows that danced on the walls like a vision from another world. I heard rushing in my head, and I knew it had to be wings. I felt something near me. I ran to the door and flung myself against it, kicking and pounding and screaming. "Miss Eyre, are you ill?" Bessie asked when she opened the door. "Let me out," I begged. "I saw a light, a ghost." "What is this?" Mrs. Reed stormed along the corridor. "I gave orders that Jane Eyre should be left in the Red Room until I came to her myself." "She screams so loud, ma'am," Bessie pleaded. "Oh, Aunt, have pity. Forgive me," I begged. "I cannot endure it." "Silence," she snapped. "You will stay here an hour longer, until you can be perfectly still." She thrust me back into the room and locked me in. Then, with my back against the door and the darkness of the room closing in around me, I passed out. I awoke in my own bed. Bessie stood nearby with the man who was sometimes called when the servants were sick. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. I nodded and said, "Mr. Lloyd." "Do you have any pain? Can you tell me what happened to make you ill?" "She had a fall," Bessie said. "I was knocked down," I told him, insulted by the suggestion that I was a clumsy child who fell down. "But that didn't make me ill. I was shut up in a dark room where there is a ghost." "A ghost?" Mr. Lloyd said with a smile. "You are afraid of ghosts?" Of Mr. Reed's ghost I am. None of the servants will go into that room in the dark, but they shut me up in there. It was cruel. Mr. Lloyd continued to ask questions. I told him that I was an orphan with cousins who abused me and an aunt who punished me for the bad behavior of her own children. Have you any relatives beside Mrs. Reed? He asked. I don't know. Aunt Reed said I might have some poor relations called Eyre, but she knew nothing about them. If you had such relatives, would you like to go live with them? I thought about that. I knew little of being poor, only what my cousins said. I believed all the poor to be ragged, dirty, hungry, cold, and given to terrible acts. I was not brave enough to escape the Reeds that way, so I shook my head. Aunt Reed said they are all beggars. I wouldn't like to beg, I said. Would you like to go to school? Mr. Lloyd asked. I thought about that. John went to school and hated it, but I did not let that trouble me. John liked very few things. I knew you learned things at school, and I liked that idea. Yes, I finally replied. Well, let us see what happens, he said. The child could use a change of air and scene. Then he left to speak to Mrs. Reed. Afterward, I learned that I would be sent to school as soon as possible. And that was chapter 1 from the book Jane Eyre, which is adapted by Jan Fields from the original Jane Eyre. So if you want to see what happens, stop in at the library, check it out, and you can finish the book on your own. Thanks, and keep reading.